The Copper Creek Saloon buzzed with the usual Friday night crowd of ranch hands, miners, and drifters, all seeking to wash away another week of Montana's unforgiving labor with whiskey and cards. Smoke hung thick in the air, mixing with the sounds of laughter, clinking glasses, and the off-key piano in the corner. Jake Morrison sat alone at his usual table, nursing his third whiskey of the evening. At 32, he was considered one of the finest cowboys in the territory, strong, reliable, and skilled with both rope and rifle. His weathered hands told stories of countless hours working cattle under the big Montana sky, and his steel gray eyes held the kind of steady calm that came from years of facing down ornery bulls and harsh winters. But Jake Morrison was also profoundly lonely. Well, if it ain't our favorite bachelor, the voice belonged to Chuck Henley, the loudest and most obnoxious of the local ranch hands. He swaggered over with his usual gang of followers, all of them well into their cups. Still drinking alone, Jake? Man your age should have a wife and a passel of young'uns by now. Jake didn't look up from his glass. Some men ain't meant for marriage, Chuck. You'd know that if you paid attention to how fast your own wife runs when she sees you coming. The other men laughed, but Chuck's face darkened. He was the type of man who couldn't let a slight pass, especially in front of an audience. Is that so? Or maybe you're just too particular. Maybe you think you're too good for the available ladies in Copper Creek. Chuck, leave it be, warned Tom Bradley, the most sensible of the group. Jake's business is his own. But Chuck was warming to his theme, the whiskey making him bolder and meaner. I bet our high and mighty Jake here wouldn't have the guts to marry any woman we picked for him. Probably turn tail and run at the first suggestion. Jake finally looked up, his gray eyes cold as winter steel. That's a fool bet, Chuck, and you're a fool for making it. Am I? Chuck's grin was nasty. Then prove it. I dare you to marry the ugliest, most unwanted woman in Copper Creek. Do that and I'll pay you $100. Back down, and everyone in this saloon will know Jake Morrison is all talk and no substance. The saloon had grown quieter, men turning to listen to the exchange. $100 was more than most cowboys made in 3 months. Serious money that could buy a man a small spread of his own. But the insult cut deeper than the money attracted. And who exactly did you have in mind for this generous offer? Jake asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Chuck's grin widened. Clara Hewitt, the orphan girl who works at Murphy's General Store, plain as a fence post and twice as skinny. Got a face that could curdle milk and a tongue sharp enough to cut glass. She's 25 years old and ain't never had so much as a bow call on her. Jake knew Clara Hewitt by sight. A thin, severe-looking woman who kept to herself and seemed to regard the world with perpetual disapproval. She wore drab brown dresses that hung loose on her frame and kept her mousy brown hair pulled back in a tight bun. She rarely spoke to customers beyond the necessities of business, and when she did, her voice was clipped and efficient. She ain't exactly what you'd call marriage material. Chuck continued, enjoying the attention. Word is she's got a temper that could peel paint and opinions about everything under the sun. What man wants a wife who thinks she knows better than he does? Chuck, this has gone far enough. Tom Bradley tried again, but the damage was done. The challenge had been issued publicly, and Jake's reputation hung in the balance. Jake Morrison had spent his entire adult life proving himself to his fellow cowboys, to the ranchers who hired him, to a world that respected only strength and competence. He'd never backed down from a challenge, never let another man question his courage or integrity. $100? Jake confirmed, $100. But you got to actually marry her, not just propose. Wedding ceremony, marriage certificate, the whole thing. And you gotta stay married for at least a month to prove it ain't just a joke. Jake drained his whiskey and stood up. At 6 feet 2 inches, he towered over Chuck and most of the other men in the saloon. You got yourself a bet, Chuck Henley. But when I collect that $100, I don't want to hear another word out of you about my personal business. The saloon erupted in excited chatter as men began placing side bets on whether Jake would actually go through with it. Some admired his courage, others thought he was plumb crazy. But everyone agreed it would be the most interesting thing to happen in Copper Creek in years. As Jake pushed through the crowd toward the saloon doors, Tom Bradley caught his arm. Jake, you don't have to do this. Chuck's just running his mouth because he's drunk and stupid. Jake looked back at the expectant faces, at Chuck's smug grin, at the men who were already laying odds on his failure. Yes, Tom, I do have to do this. A man's word is all he's got out here. If I back down now, I'll never hear the end of it. But marriage, Jake, That's not something you undo easy. Jake pulled his hat down low over his eyes. Maybe it's time I stopped being alone anyway. Clara Hewitt might not be much to look at, but she's got to be better company than an empty cabin and a bottle of whiskey. As he stepped out into the cool Montana night, Jake Morrison had no idea that his impulsive acceptance of a cruel dare would lead him to discover that true beauty had very little to do with what met the eye, and that sometimes the most unexpected people could change your life in ways you never imagined possible. The stars were bright overhead as he walked toward his horse, already planning how he would approach Clara Hewitt with the strangest marriage proposal in Copper Creek's history. Saturday morning found Jake Morrison standing outside Murphy's General Store, his hat in his hands and his stomach tied in knots. He'd spent the entire night thinking about the foolish bet he'd accepted, and with the cold light of dawn had come the realization of just how complicated this situation could become. He'd seen Clara Hewitt work. She was efficient, intelligent, and completely professional. She also had a reputation for having no patience with nonsense or foolishness. How exactly did a man approach a woman and explain that he wanted to marry her because of a saloon bet? The bell above the door chimed as Jake entered the store. Murphy's was the largest mercantile in Copper Creek, carrying everything from farming supplies to ladies' fabrics to penny candy. Clara stood behind the main counter, inventorying a shipment of canned goods with precise, methodical movements. In the morning light streaming through the store windows, Jake got his first really good look at the woman Chuck Henley had called the ugliest in town. Clara was indeed thin, almost fragile-looking, with sharp cheekbones and a pointed chin. Her brown hair was pulled back severely, and her dress was a practical gray that did nothing to flatter her figure. But Jake noticed things Chuck had missed. Clara's hands were graceful and sure as she worked, her posture was straight and dignified, and her dark eyes held an intelligence that seemed to take in everything around her. When she moved, there was an economy of motion that spoke of someone who never wasted effort or time. "Mr. Morrison," Clara said without looking up from her work, "I heard about last night's entertainment at the saloon. I assume that's why you're here." Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. News traveled fast in a small town, and Clara was clearly no fool. "Miss Hewitt, That is, how much did you hear?" "Enough." Clara finished counting a stack of cans and made a note in her ledger. "Chuck Henley wagered you wouldn't have the courage to marry me. You accepted the bet for $100 and the preservation of your reputation. Am I missing any important details?" The directness of her response caught Jake off guard. He'd expected tears, anger, or wounded feelings, not this calm, analytical summary of the situation. "Miss Hewitt, I want you to know that I never meant to hurt my feelings." Clara finally looked up, meeting his eyes directly. "Mr. Morrison, I'm 25 years old and have been the subject of cruel comments since I was old enough to understand them. I'm not beautiful, I'm not charming, and I'm not particularly pleasant company. These are facts, not insults." Jake found himself studying her face more carefully. Her features were sharp rather than soft, true, but they were also distinctive and intelligent. Her eyes, he realized, were actually quite remarkable, a deep brown with flecks of gold that caught the light when she moved. "I don't think Chuck Henley is qualified to judge much of anything," Jake said carefully. "Perhaps not, but his assessment wasn't entirely inaccurate." Clara closed her ledger and gave Jake her full attention. "The question is, what exactly are you proposing? And please don't insult my intelligence by pretending this is a romantic gesture." Jake had never met a woman who spoke so directly about uncomfortable subjects. Most of the ladies he'd known would have either fainted or slapped him by now. Clara's matter-of-fact approach was oddly refreshing. "I'm proposing marriage," Jake said, deciding to match her honesty. "A real marriage, legal and binding. I won't lie to you about why. The bet is part of it, but I've been thinking about it all night, and maybe there's more to it than that. Such as, I'm tired of being alone, Miss Hewitt. I've got a good cabin on a nice piece of land about 5 miles out of town. I make steady money working cattle, and I've got some savings put aside. I could provide for a wife, give her a comfortable life." Clara studied him for a long moment. "And what would you expect from this wife?" "Companionship, I suppose. Someone to talk to at the end of a long day. Maybe someone who could help make my place feel more like a home and less like just a place to sleep." "You're not talking about love?" "No, ma'am, I'm not. I figure love is something that either grows between people over time or it doesn't, can't be forced or faked. Clara was quiet for so long that Jake began to think she was formulating a polite way to tell him he was insane. When she finally spoke, her words surprised him completely. I've been working in this store since I was 16 years old. Mr. Morrison, I live in a tiny room above the shop. I have no family and no prospects for anything different. In another 10 years, I'll still be here, doing exactly the same thing, growing older and more set in my ways with each passing season. She walked around the counter and stood directly in front of him. Up close, Jake could see that her dark eyes held depths he hadn't noticed before. Not just intelligence, but also loneliness and a kind of quiet strength. If I were to consider your proposal, Clara continued, what assurance would I have that this isn't simply a month-long joke at my expense? That you won't collect your $100 and then find a way to end the marriage? You'd have my word, Jake said simply. And I'd be willing to put it in writing if that would make you feel more secure. Your word. Clara smiled for the first time since he'd entered the store, and the expression transformed her entire face. In my experience, Mr. Morrison, a man's word is either worthless or the most valuable thing he possesses. Which category do you fall into? I guess you'd have to marry me to find out. Clara laughed, a genuine warm sound that made Jake realize he'd never heard her laugh before. That's either the most honest proposal or the most ridiculous one I've ever received. Probably both, Jake admitted. Clara walked to the window and looked out at the street, where the normal Saturday bustle of Copper Creek was beginning. When she turned back to Jake, her expression was resolved. I accept your proposal, Mr. Morrison, but I have conditions. Name them. First, this will be a real marriage in every sense. No separate bedrooms, no pretending we're just business partners. If we're doing this, we're doing it properly. Jake felt his pulse quicken. Agreed. Second, I expect to be treated with respect and kindness, regardless of what others may say about my appearance or character. That goes without saying. Third, if either of us finds this arrangement truly unbearable, we discuss it honestly rather than just enduring in silence. Fair enough. Clara extended her hand to him. Then we have an agreement, Mr. Morrison. When would you like to have this wedding? Jake shook her hand, surprised by the firmness of her grip. How about tomorrow afternoon? No point in giving the whole town more time to gossip. Tomorrow it is. Clara's smile returned, and Jake found himself looking forward to seeing it again. I should warn you, though. You may find that marrying the ugly orphan girl turns out to be more than you bargained for. As Jake left the store, he had the strangest feeling that Clara Hewitt had just issued him a challenge of her own. And for the first time since accepting Chuck Henley's foolish bet, Jake Morrison found himself genuinely curious about what his wedding night might bring. Sunday afternoon brought half the population of Copper Creek to the small white church at the end of Main Street. Word of Jake Morrison's impending marriage to Clara Hewitt had spread like wildfire, and everyone wanted to witness what many considered either the most romantic gesture or the most foolish decision in recent memory. Jake stood at the altar in his best suit, a dark blue wool that he'd bought 2 years earlier, for his father's funeral and hadn't worn since. His hands were steady, but his mind raced with second thoughts. In the cold light of a Sunday morning, the whole situation seemed increasingly surreal. Reverend Patterson, a kindly man in his 60s who had performed more than his share of unusual ceremonies, leaned close to Jake. Son, I've got to ask one more time, are you certain about this? Marriage is a sacred covenant, not a business arrangement. I'm certain, Reverend, Jake replied, though he wasn't entirely sure that was true. Miss Hewitt and I have discussed this thoroughly. We both know what we're agreeing to. The church doors opened and Clara entered alone. She'd refused Jake's offer to escort her, saying she preferred to walk herself down the aisle. The sight of her stopped conversations mid-sentence throughout the church. Clara had transformed herself completely. Instead of her usual drab brown or gray, she wore a dress of deep blue silk that complemented her dark eyes beautifully. Her hair, freed from its usual severe bun, fell in soft waves around her shoulders, revealing that it was much longer and more lustrous than anyone had realized. She'd also done something subtle with cosmetics that highlighted her cheekbones and made her eyes appear larger and more luminous. Jake felt his breath catch in his throat. This was not the same woman he'd spoken to yesterday morning. Clara Hewitt was still not conventionally beautiful, but she was striking, elegant, and carried herself with a confidence that commanded attention. As she walked down the aisle, Jake noticed something else. Clara was completely ignoring the whispered comments and curious stares from the congregation. Her focus was entirely on him, and there was something in her expression that made his heart beat faster. "Jake Morrison," she said quietly as she took her place beside him, "you look like you've seen a ghost." "Maybe I have," Jake replied honestly. "You look different." "I look like myself," Clara corrected. Perhaps for the first time in years. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. Reverend Patterson spoke about the sanctity of marriage, the importance of mutual respect and commitment, and the way that two people could become stronger together than they ever were apart. When the time came for vows, both Jake and Clara spoke their promises clearly and without hesitation. "Do you, Jacob Morrison, take Clara Hewitt to be your lawful wedded wife, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." "Do you, Clara Hewitt, take Jacob Morrison to be your lawful wedded husband, to have and to hold in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, as long as you both shall live?" "I do." When Reverend Patterson pronounced them husband and wife, Jake leaned down to kiss his new bride. It was meant to be a simple ceremonial kiss, but the moment their lips met, something unexpected happened. The kiss lingered, deepened, and Jake felt something stir in his chest that had nothing to do with the bet that had brought them here. Clara's eyes were bright with tears when they separated, though she was smiling. "Well, Mr. Morrison, we've done it now." "Yes, Mrs. Morrison, we have." The congregation erupted in applause and congratulations, though Jake noticed that Chuck Henley was conspicuously absent. Most of the well-wishers seemed genuinely happy for them, though he caught more than a few puzzled looks as people tried to reconcile this elegant woman with their memories of the drab store clerk. After the ceremony, there was a small reception in the church hall. Mrs. Patterson had organized a simple meal, and several of the local ladies had contributed cakes and pies. Jake found himself standing beside his new wife, accepting congratulations and trying to process the magnitude of what they'd just done. "You two make a lovely couple," said Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife. "Clara, dear, that dress is absolutely beautiful. Wherever did you find it?" "I made it myself," Clara replied. "I've always enjoyed sewing, though I haven't had much occasion to make anything pretty before now." Jake looked at her in surprise. He'd had no idea that Clara possessed such skills. The dress was expertly crafted, with details that spoke of considerable talent and experience. "You made that?" Jake asked when Mrs. Henderson moved on to speak with other guests. "Among other things," Clara replied cryptically. "There's quite a lot you don't know about me yet. Husband." The word husband sent a strange thrill through Jake. This morning he'd been a bachelor cowboy with no responsibilities beyond his job and his horse. Now he was a married man with a wife who seemed to hold more surprises than he'd bargained for. As the afternoon wore on, Jake found himself studying Clara more closely. She moved through the reception with grace and warmth, thanking people for their good wishes and deflecting the more intrusive questions with humor and intelligence. Several times he caught her in animated conversations about subjects he wouldn't have expected her to know. Literature with the school teacher, farming techniques with some of the ranchers' wives, even politics with old Mr. Bradley. "Your wife is quite remarkable," Tom Bradley commented, joining Jake near the refreshment table. "I had no idea Clara was so articulate." "Neither did I," Jake admitted. "You might want to ask yourself why that is," Tom suggested gently. Maybe the problem wasn't that Clara lacked interesting qualities. Maybe it was that no one ever bothered to look for them. As the reception wound down and guests began to depart, Jake found himself both eager and nervous about the evening ahead. He and Clara would be going to his cabin, their cabin now, to begin their life together. But what exactly did that mean? They barely knew each other despite having lived in the same small town for years. Clara appeared at his elbow as he was lost in thought. "Ready to go home, husband?" "Ready as I'll ever be, wife." As they climbed into Jake's wagon for the ride to his cabin, Clara placed her hand on his arm. "Jake, I want you to know that whatever happens tonight, whatever we discover about each other, I'm grateful for this chance. For the first time in my adult life, I feel like I'm moving towards something instead of just existing day after day." Jake covered her hand with his own. "I feel the same way, Clara. And I'm starting to think that maybe Chuck Henley did us both a favor. even if he didn't mean to. As their wagon rolled away from the church toward Jake's cabin in the Montana countryside, both bride and groom wondered what revelations the evening would bring. Neither of them suspected that by morning, their understanding of each other and themselves would be completely transformed. The sun was setting over the mountains as they began their new life together, and Jake Morrison was about to discover that he had seriously underestimated the woman he'd just married. Jake's cabin sat in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills dotted with pine and aspen trees. It was a solid, comfortable structure he'd built himself over several years, 2 rooms downstairs with a kitchen and sitting area, and a loft bedroom under the peaked roof. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, and wide windows faced east to catch the morning sun. As their wagon pulled up to the cabin, Clara studied her new home with approval. "It's lovely, Jake. Much larger than I expected." "I always figured I'd have a family someday," Jake said, helping her down from the wagon. "Built it big enough for children to run around in." "Children," Clara repeated thoughtfully. "Is that something you still want?" Jake felt heat rise in his cheeks. They'd agreed to a real marriage, but they hadn't discussed specifics like children. I suppose that would depend on how things work out between us." Clara's smile was enigmatic. "I suppose it would." Jake carried Clara's single trunk into the cabin, surprised by how heavy it was. "What do you have in here?" "Rocks, books mostly, and some projects I've been working on." "Books?" Jake set the trunk down carefully. "What kind of books?" "All kinds. History, science, literature, philosophy. Mr. Murphy orders them for me from back east. It's one of the few advantages of working in a general store. You can special order almost anything." Jake stared at her. He'd had no idea that Clara was educated, let alone scholarly. Most women in Copper Creek could read and write, but few had the means or inclination to study advanced subjects. "Where did you learn to read books like that?" Jake asked. "The same place I learned to sew, cook, manage accounts, and speak 3 languages," Clara replied, unpacking items from her trunk. "The St. Catherine's Orphanage back in Chicago. The nuns believed that knowledge was the only thing that couldn't be taken away from you, so they educated us thoroughly." 3 languages? "English, French, and Spanish. Also some Latin, though I'm a bit rusty." Clara pulled out several thick volumes and set them on Jake's simple wooden table. The nun said that an educated woman could make her way in the world no matter what circumstances she faced. Jake picked up one of the books, a treatise on animal husbandry that looked well worn from reading. "This is about cattle breeding, among other things. I've been studying ranching and farming techniques for years. I figured if I was ever going to escape the life of a store clerk, I'd need to understand other ways of making a living." Escape? Jake was beginning to realize that Clara Hewitt, Clara Morrison now, was far more complex than he'd ever imagined. Clara turned to face him fully, and Jake saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before, a kind of fierce determination that made her dark eyes flash. "Jake, I need to tell you something about why I accepted your proposal. It wasn't just because I was lonely or desperate, though both of those things were true. It was because I've been planning to leave Copper Creek for years, and your offer gave me the perfect opportunity." "Leave? To go where?" "California, Oregon. Somewhere a woman can own property, start a business, build something of her own." Clara moved to the window and looked out at the Montana landscape. "I've been saving every penny I earned for the past 9 years. I have almost $800 hidden away, enough to buy land and equipment for a small farm or ranch." Jake felt as if the ground had shifted beneath his feet. $800? How did a store clerk save that much money? By living on almost nothing and investing wisely. Also by doing work on the side that most people don't know about. Clara's smile held secrets. "I've been keeping books for half the businesses in town, doing alterations and dressmaking for the wealthier ladies, and tutoring children whose parents want them to have better educations. Why didn't anyone know about this? Because I didn't want them to know. If people had realized I was educated and ambitious, they would have seen me as a threat instead of just ignoring me. It was easier to let them think I was just a plain, unremarkable spinster with no prospects." Jake sank into his favorite chair, trying to process these revelations. "So when I proposed marriage, you saw it as an opportunity," Clara confirmed. "A chance to become a partner instead of an employee. A chance to use my knowledge and skills to build something worthwhile." She turned from the window to face him directly. But I also saw it as a chance to find out what kind of man you really are, Jake Morrison. What do you mean? Clara walked over and sat on the edge of the table, her skirts rustling softly. In the lamplight, her transformation from this morning seemed even more dramatic. Everyone in town knows your reputation. Honest, hardworking, reliable. But I wanted to know if you were the kind of man who could see beyond surface appearances. If you could appreciate intelligence in a woman, respect her opinions, maybe even love her for her mind as much as her body. Jake felt his heart beating faster. And what have you concluded? That remains to be seen. Clara's voice was soft but challenging. The question is, what kind of marriage do you want, Jake? One where I pretend to be the simple, quiet wife you thought you were getting? Or one where we're genuine partners, building something together that neither of us could achieve alone? Jake stood up and moved closer to her, close enough to see the gold flecks in her dark eyes, close enough to catch the subtle scent of lavender in her hair. I think, he said slowly, that I've been a fool for not seeing who you really were long before today. And now that you do see? Jake reached out and gently touched her cheek. Now I'm wondering how a woman as remarkable as you ended up married to a simple cowboy who was too blind to notice her, until someone dared him to take a closer look. Clara's smile was radiant. Maybe because that simple cowboy was brave enough to take the dare. And maybe because he's not as simple as he thinks he is. Clara, I need you to know something. This marriage, it started as a bet, but it's not going to stay that way. Not after tonight. Not after learning who you really are. And who am I, Jake Morrison? Jake leaned closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. You're the woman who's going to help me become the man I never knew I could be. When their lips met this time, there was nothing ceremonial about the kiss. It was passionate, hungry, and full of promise for the future they would build together. And as Clara's arms wound around his neck, Jake Morrison realized that he'd just married not only the most intelligent woman in Montana territory, but quite possibly the most beautiful as well. The ugly orphan girl had been an illusion. The real Clara Morrison was a revelation that would change his life forever. Dawn came gently to the Montana Valley, painting the sky in soft pastels of pink and gold. Jake woke slowly, initially disoriented by the unfamiliar warmth beside him. Then memory flooded back, the wedding, the revelations, the night that had changed everything he thought he knew about marriage and love. Clara was already awake, propped up on one elbow watching him with amusement. Her dark hair fell around her shoulders like a silk curtain, and her skin glowed warm and golden in the morning light. Good morning, husband, she said softly. Good morning, wife. Jake reached up to touch her face, still hardly believing this remarkable woman was his. How long have you been awake? A while. I was thinking about our conversation last night about building something together. Clara's eyes sparkled with excitement. I have some ideas I'd like to discuss with you. Jake stretched, feeling more rested and content than he had in years. What kind of ideas? Clara slipped out of bed and walked to her trunk, returning with a leather portfolio bound with string. Plans I've been developing for years. Look at this. She spread out several hand-drawn maps and diagrams on the bed. Jake sat up to examine them, his eyes widening as he realized what he was looking at. These are ranch layouts, he said in amazement. Detailed plans for land management, water systems, breeding programs. I've been studying every successful ranch operation I could learn about, Clara explained eagerly. The problem with most cattle operations out here is inefficiency. Poor grazing management, inadequate water systems, no systematic approach to breeding for better stock. Jake studied the diagrams more closely. They were professionally detailed, showing optimal layouts for pasture rotation, strategic placement of water sources, and even plans for diversified agriculture to supplement cattle income. Clara, these plans are brilliant. Where did you learn to think like this? From books, from observation, and from keeping the accounts for Mr. Henderson's bank. I've seen the financial records for every ranch in the territory. I know which ones are profitable and which ones are struggling. And more importantly, I know why. Jake examined a detailed breeding chart that showed how to improve cattle stock over several generations. This would revolutionize ranching in Montana territory. That's the idea. Clara sat beside him, her excitement infectious. Jake, your land here is perfect for implementing these concepts. You've got natural water sources, varied terrain for rotational grazing, and enough acreage to make it truly profitable. But implementing something like this would take capital, equipment, breeding stock. It would take about $800 to get started properly, Clara said with a significant look. Jake stared at her. Your savings. You're talking about investing your entire nest egg in improving my ranch. Our ranch, Clara corrected firmly. I'm talking about us becoming partners in building something extraordinary. Something that could serve as a model for sustainable ranching throughout the territory. Jake set down the papers and took Clara's hands in his. Why would you risk everything on a man you barely know? Clara's expression grew serious. Because last night you proved something to me. When I told you about my education, my plans, my ambitions, you weren't threatened or dismissive. You were intrigued. Most men would have been angry that their wife had deceived them about being simple and uneducated. I was never looking for a simple wife. Clara, I was just too afraid to hope for an extraordinary one. Clara leaned forward and kissed him softly. Then we're going to make an excellent team, Jake Morrison. They spent the morning going through Clara's plans in detail. Her research was thorough, and her ideas were innovative, but Jake's practical experience provided crucial insights about implementation. Together they began refining the concepts into a workable strategy. The first thing we need is better breeding stock, Jake observed, studying Clara's genetic charts. These local cattle are hardy but small. We need bulls that can improve size and meat quality while maintaining adaptability to harsh winters. I've already identified sources, Clara replied, producing another set of notes. There's a breeder in Colorado who's developed exactly the kind of stock we need. It would require a trip to purchase and transport them, but the investment would pay off within 2 breeding cycles. Jake was amazed by the depth of her preparation. How long have you been planning this? About 5 years. I started by just trying to understand why some ranches succeeded while others failed. The more I learned, the more I realized that most failures came from poor planning and inadequate capital management, not bad luck or harsh weather. And you've been waiting for the right opportunity to test your theories? I've been waiting for the right partner, Clara corrected. Someone with practical knowledge, good land, and enough vision to take calculated risks for long-term gains. Jake stood up and walked to the window, looking out at his modest spread with new eyes. Clara's plans could transform this simple ranch into one of the most successful operations in Montana territory. But more than that, they represented a future he'd never dared to imagine. A true partnership with a woman who challenged and inspired him. There's something I need to tell you, Jake said, turning back to Clara. About Chuck Henley's bet. Clara's expression grew wary. What about it? I'm not going to collect the $100. In fact, I'm going to pay Chuck his $100 and tell him the bet is off. Why? Jake moved back to the bed and took Clara in his arms. Because I don't want there to be any question about why we're married. I don't want anyone, including us, to wonder if money played a role in our decision to build a life together. Clara's eyes filled with tears. That $100 could buy us additional breeding stock. We'll find another way. Our partnership is worth more than any amount of money Chuck Henley might offer. Clara kissed him with a passion that made Jake's heart race. I love you, she whispered against his lips. I know it's too soon to say that, but I do. I love your integrity, your courage, and your willingness to see me for who I really am. I love you too, Jake replied, the words feeling more natural than anything he'd ever said. And I'm going to spend every day proving that marrying you was the smartest thing I've ever done. Bet or no bet. As they held each other in the golden morning light, both Jake and Clara realized that what had begun as a cruel dare had become the foundation for something beautiful and lasting. Their unusual beginning would become the strength of their partnership. 2 people who had chosen each other with clear eyes and open hearts, ready to build a future neither could have imagined alone. The transformation was complete. The lonely cowboy and the ugly orphan had discovered that true beauty lay not in surface appearances, but in the courage to risk everything for love, partnership, and shared dreams. 3 weeks into their marriage, Jake and Clara had settled into a rhythm that felt both natural and exciting. Clara proved to be not only an intelligent partner in ranch planning, but also a capable homemaker who brought warmth and organization to Jake's previously Spartan cabin. More importantly, she challenged him intellectually in ways that made him see his own potential differently. The Henderson cattle contract came through, Clara announced, looking up from her correspondence as Jake returned from checking the fence lines. They're willing to purchase our entire spring calf crop at premium prices, provided we can guarantee the quality improvements you promised. Jake washed his hands in the basin Clara had prepared and kissed her cheek. That's excellent news. It means we can move forward with purchasing the breeding stock from Colorado. There's just one problem, Clara said, her expression growing concerned. Mr. Henderson wants to inspect our operation personally before finalizing the contract. He's heard rumors about our unusual partnership and wants to assure himself that we're serious business people. Jake felt a familiar knot form in his stomach. While their marriage had been personally transformative, the business community remained skeptical about their partnership. Some questioned whether Clara's ideas were practical, while others doubted Jake's ability to implement such sophisticated management techniques. When does he want to visit?
Next week?
And Jake, Clara hesitated. There's something else. Chuck Henley has been spreading stories around town about our marriage. He's telling people that you're being manipulated by a woman who thinks she's smarter than every man in the territory. Jake's jaw tightened. What kind of stories? He claims that I've somehow tricked you into giving me control of your ranch, that I'm planning to sell out and disappear with your money. Clara's voice was steady, but Jake could see the hurt in her eyes. Some people are starting to believe him. That's ridiculous. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not easily fooled. But they don't know me, Jake. To most people in Copper Creek, I'm still just the strange orphan girl who got lucky enough to trap a good man into marriage. Clara stood and moved to the window, looking out at the land they were working so hard to improve. Maybe we should reconsider some of our plans. Scale back to something more conventional. Jake joined her at the window and wrapped his arms around her from behind. Clara Morrison, are you suggesting we abandon our dreams because a few small-minded people can't appreciate what we're building? I'm suggesting that maybe I was naive to think people would accept such rapid changes. Maybe we're moving too fast. Jake turned her to face him. Do you believe in our plans? Absolutely. Do you trust me to implement them properly? Without question. Then that's all that matters. Let Henderson come inspect our operation. Let Chuck Henley spread his rumors. We'll prove ourselves through results, not words. Clara's smile returned, though uncertainty still shadowed her eyes. Sometimes I wonder if I've made your life more complicated than it needed to be. Clara, before I married you, my life was simple because it was empty. Now it's complicated because it's full of purpose and possibility. I'll take complicated any day. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching. Through the window they could see Tom Bradley riding up with two men Jake didn't recognize. Well-dressed gentlemen who looked distinctly out of place in the Montana countryside. Mr. Morrison? The older of the two strangers stepped forward as Jake and Clara emerged from the cabin. I'm James Patterson from the Montana Territorial Agricultural Commission. This is Dr. William Hartwell from the University of California. We're here to investigate reports of innovative ranching techniques being developed in this area. Jake felt Clara stiffen beside him. What kind of investigation? The kind that could result in significant financial support if your methods prove sound, Dr. Hartwell interjected. We've heard remarkable claims about efficiency improvements and sustainable land management. If these claims are accurate, the Territorial Commission is prepared to offer funding for expansion and documentation of your techniques. Clara stepped forward, her professional demeanor returning instantly. Gentlemen, I'm Clara Morrison. Perhaps you'd like to see our operational plans and preliminary results? For the next 3 hours, Clara walked the visitors through their ranch improvements with the confidence of someone presenting to academic peers. She explained their rotational grazing system, demonstrated the water management improvements, and showed detailed records of efficiency gains they'd already achieved. Jake watched with growing pride as Clara answered every technical question with precision and depth. Dr. Hartwell, in particular, seemed impressed by her systematic approach and thorough documentation. Mrs. Morrison, Dr. Hartwell said finally, where did you acquire such extensive knowledge of agricultural science? Through study, observation, and practical application, Clara replied simply. I believe that any challenge can be solved through careful research and intelligent implementation. Remarkable, Patterson murmured, reviewing Clara's charts. These efficiency improvements could revolutionize cattle ranching throughout the territory. Mr. Morrison, you're fortunate to have such a knowledgeable partner. Jake grinned. Don't I know it? As the men prepared to leave, Dr. Hartwell turned to Clara with a proposal that left both her and Jake speechless. Mrs. Morrison, the University of California is establishing a new program in agricultural sciences. We're particularly interested in recruiting faculty members who combine theoretical knowledge with practical experience. Would you consider a teaching position that would allow you to continue developing these techniques while training the next generation of ranchers and farmers? Clara's face went pale. You're offering me a job? At a university? A professorship, actually. With full research funding and the opportunity to establish a demonstration ranch using your methods. Jake felt his heart sink. This was Clara's dream, the chance to use her knowledge on a grand scale to be recognized for her intelligence and innovations. How could he ask her to turn down such an opportunity? That's an incredible offer, Clara said slowly, but I'm afraid I must decline. Both visitors looked surprised. May I ask why? Dr. Hartwell inquired. Clara reached for Jake's hand, intertwining their fingers. Because I'm not just developing these techniques for academic advancement. I'm building a life here with my husband, creating something that belongs to both of us. The research and innovation are important, but they're not more important than the partnership that makes them possible. Jake squeezed her hand, overwhelmed by gratitude and love. Clara, if this is what you want. What I want, Clara interrupted, is to prove that two people working together can achieve more than either could accomplish alone. The university will have to find another professor. I'm exactly where I belong. After the visitors left, Jake and Clara stood together watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in brilliant oranges and purples. Do you ever regret it? Jake asked quietly. Giving up the chance for recognition? For the kind of life your education could have provided? Clara smiled and leaned against his shoulder. Jake, 3 months ago I was a lonely store clerk with no prospects and no hope for anything better. Today I'm a respected rancher, a cherished wife, and a partner in building something extraordinary. How could I possibly regret that? Even when people like Chuck Henley try to diminish what we've accomplished? Especially then, Clara replied firmly. Let them talk. Our success will speak louder than their skepticism. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses announced another visitor. This time it was Chuck Henley himself, accompanied by several of his drinking companions from the saloon. Well, well, Chuck called out as he dismounted. If it ain't the famous Mr. and Mrs. Morrison. Heard you had some fancy visitors today. University folks, they say. What do you want, Chuck? Jake's voice was cold. Just came to settle our bet, Chuck replied with a nasty grin. Been a month now since your wedding. Time to collect my $100. Jake straightened, his hand moving instinctively to Clara's back in a protective gesture. There is no bet to settle, Chuck. I told you that weeks ago. Oh, but there is, Chuck insisted. See, the bet was that you wouldn't have the guts to marry Clara Hewitt. But seems to me you didn't marry Clara Hewitt at all. You married some educated woman who's been pretending to be a simple store clerk for years. That's not the same thing. Clara stepped forward, her eyes flashing with anger. Mr. Henley, I am exactly the same person I was before my marriage. The only thing that's changed is that I no longer see any reason to hide my capabilities to make small-minded men feel more comfortable. Is that so? Chuck's grin widened. Then maybe it's time for another bet. I'll wager you $1,000 that within 6 months, your fancy wife will get bored with playing rancher and run off to find herself a more sophisticated husband. The insult hung in the air like a challenge. Jake felt his temper rising, but Clara's calm voice cut through his anger. Mr. Henley, she said with deadly quiet, I'll take that bet myself. $1,000 that says I'll still be here, still married to Jake Morrison and still making this ranch more successful than you could ever imagine. But I'll raise the stakes. When I win, you publicly apologize for every cruel word you've spoken about me, and you leave my husband and me in peace. Chuck looked uncertain for the first time since arriving. And if I win? You won't, Clara replied with absolute confidence. But if you did, I'll give you the $1,000 and publicly admit that you were right about me all along. Jake wanted to protest. $1,000 was a huge sum, and Chuck Henley was vindictive enough to cause real trouble trying to win such a bet. But looking at Clara's determined face, he realized that she knew exactly what she was doing. Done, Chuck declared, extending his hand. 6 months from today. Clara shook his hand firmly. 6 months, Mr. Henley. I look forward to your apology. As Chuck and his companions rode away, Jake turned to his wife with a mixture of admiration and concern. "Clara, that was either very brave or very foolish." "It was necessary," Clara replied calmly. "Sometimes you have to take a stand to protect what matters most. And what matters most to me is our life together, our work together, and our future together." Jake kissed her then, there in the yard of their ranch as the Montana stars began to appear overhead. "I love you, Mrs. Morrison, and I'm betting everything I have that you're right about us." "Then we'd better make sure we win," Clara whispered against his lips. "Because I have no intention of letting Chuck Henley or anyone else destroy what we've built." As they walked back toward their cabin, hand in hand, both Jake and Clara knew that the next 6 months would test their partnership in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But they also knew that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together, as equal partners in love, in business, and in life. 6 months later, the Morrison Ranch had become the most talked-about operation in Montana territory. Clara's innovative techniques had produced results that exceeded even her own optimistic projections. Their cattle were healthier, their land more productive, and their profits had tripled compared to Jake's previous best year. More importantly, word of their success had spread throughout the territory. Ranchers came from hundreds of miles away to observe their methods, and Clara had begun offering consulting services to help other operations implement similar improvements. The day of Chuck Henley's bet deadline dawned crisp and clear, perfect autumn weather that painted the aspen trees gold against the deep blue Montana sky. Jake and Clara had invited the entire town of Copper Creek to their ranch for a harvest celebration, and to witness the resolution of Chuck's foolish wager. "Nervous?" Jake asked as they surveyed the preparations. Clara had organized everything with her usual efficiency, but today felt different. Today would publicly vindicate not just their marriage, but their partnership and their vision for the future. "Not nervous. Excited," Clara replied, adjusting the blue dress she'd worn for their wedding. She'd taken to wearing prettier clothes regularly now, no longer hiding her natural grace and intelligence behind drab colors and severe styles. "We've worked too hard and accomplished too much to be nervous about Chuck Henley's opinion." The first guest began arriving at noon. Tom Bradley came with his family, followed by Reverend Patterson, the Hendersons, and dozens of other Copper Creek residents. Even some of the more skeptical ranchers who'd initially dismissed Clara's ideas were present. Having seen the undeniable evidence of the Morrison Ranch's success, Clara moved through the crowd with confidence and warmth, discussing their innovations with anyone who showed interest. Jake watched with pride as she explained complex agricultural concepts to seasoned ranchers who hung on her every word. She'd become not just his wife, but a respected leader in the community. Mr. Morrison, James Patterson from the Territorial Agricultural Commission, approached with a broad smile. "I have wonderful news. Based on our observations of your operation, the Commission has decided to establish a demonstration ranch program. We'd like to offer you and your wife a contract to serve as the model ranch for the entire territory." "What would that involve?" Jake asked. "Financial support for expansion, official recognition as a territorial agricultural center, and the opportunity to train ranchers from across the region in your methods. It would make you both quite wealthy, and Mrs. Morrison would essentially become the territory's chief agricultural advisor." Jake looked across the crowd to where Clara was animatedly discussing water management with a group of ranchers' wives. "It sounds like an incredible opportunity." "It is, and well-deserved. Your wife's innovations could transform the entire territorial economy." As the afternoon progressed, Jake noticed that Chuck Henley hadn't yet appeared. Several of his usual companions were present, looking uncomfortable and avoiding eye contact. Finally, as the sun began to set, Chuck rode up to the ranch alone. He looked different, older, somehow diminished. The swagger and arrogance that had always characterized him were gone, replaced by something that looked like genuine humility. "Morrison," Chuck called out as he dismounted. "Mrs. Morrison, I've come to settle our bet." The crowd grew quiet, sensing the significance of the moment. Clara stepped forward, Jake beside her, united in their strength and confidence. "I believe the terms were clear, Mr. Henley," Clara said calmly. "Are you prepared to honor them?" Chuck removed his hat and looked around at the assembled crowd. "Folks, I came here today to do something I should have done months ago. I want to publicly apologize to Mr. and Mrs. Morrison for the cruel things I said, for the bets I made, and for trying to diminish what they've built together. He turned specifically to Clara. "Mrs. Morrison, I was wrong about you. Wrong about your character, wrong about your marriage, and wrong about your abilities. You've proven that intelligence and determination matter more than appearance or background. This ranch is more successful than any operation in the territory, and it's because of your knowledge and hard work." Clara's eyes were bright with tears, but her voice remained steady. "Thank you, Mr. Henley. Apology accepted." Chuck reached into his pocket and pulled out a leather pouch. "This is the $1,000 I owe you. But more than that, I want you to know that I've learned something from watching your success. I've decided to implement some of your grazing techniques on my own land." "Mr. Henley," Clara said gently, "keep your money. Instead, why don't you come by next week and let me show you how to improve your water management? It'll cost you nothing but your time and attention." Chuck's eyes widened in surprise. "After everything I've done, you'd help me?" "That's what neighbors do for each other," Clara replied simply. "And besides, if your ranch becomes more successful, it benefits the entire community." The crowd erupted in applause, and Jake felt his chest swell with pride and love for his remarkable wife. She'd not only won their bet, but she'd transformed an enemy into a potential ally through grace and generosity. As the celebration continued into the evening, Jake and Clara found a quiet moment alone on their porch, watching their guests enjoy the harvest feast Clara had prepared. "So," Jake said, taking Clara's hand, "we've got an offer to become the official model ranch for the territory. Enough money to expand our operation significantly, and the respect of our entire community. What do you think about that?" Clara smiled and leaned against his shoulder. "I think it's more than I ever dared to dream when I was working in Murphy's store, wondering if I'd ever have a chance to use my education for something meaningful. Any regrets about turning down that university position?" "Not one," Clara replied firmly. "This is better than any university position could ever be. We're not just teaching theory. We're proving that innovation and partnership can create real, lasting change." Jake turned to face her fully. "Clara, I need to tell you something. That first night when you asked me what kind of marriage I wanted, I thought I knew. I thought I wanted a simple partnership, maybe some companionship to ease the loneliness. And now I know that what we have is so much more than I ever imagined possible. You're not just my wife or my business partner. You're my best friend, my greatest teacher, and the love of my life. You've made me a better man than I ever thought I could be." Clara's eyes filled with happy tears. "Jake Morrison, you took a dare to marry the ugly orphan girl, and instead you found yourself a partner who would challenge you to become the man you were always meant to be. And you found yourself a husband who sees your true beauty, not just the physical beauty. That was there all along, but the beauty of your mind, your heart, and your dreams." As they kissed under the Montana stars, surrounded by the sounds of their friends and neighbors celebrating their success, both Jake and Clara marveled at the journey that had brought them together. What began as a cruel bet had become a love story for the ages, proof that sometimes the most beautiful things in life come from the most unexpected beginnings. "So what's next for us?" Jake asked as they held each other close. Clara's smile was radiant with possibilities. "Everything, Jake. We're going to build the most successful ranch in Montana territory, raise the children we both want, and prove that two people who believe in each other can accomplish anything." "Children?" Jake's heart leaped with joy. "I'm hoping," Clara whispered, her hand moving to rest on her still flat stomach. "It's early yet, but I think our partnership might be expanding sooner than we planned."